Welcome to the latest installment of Novel at Home, bringing authors to your living room or your home office or your porch swing, wherever you're Zooming these days. Tonight, Novel, along with the Rhodes College Office of Alumni Relations and the Rhodes College Equalynx Chapter, present a panel of brilliant Rhodes alums, spotlighting Jill Fredenburg, author of LGBTQ Revolution 2.0, a celebratory collection of LGBTQ narratives. It's an open and honest depiction of life from the point of view of people who are part of its community. Friedenberg will be joined in conversation by Olivia Gacka and Isabel Wittman. Isabel Wittman is the Constituent Engagement Coordinator for Rhodes College, who also sings professionally throughout the country. She is a class of 2017 alumna of Rhodes College, where she received her bachelor's in music and education. A passionate advocate for the LGBTQ community, Isabel cares deeply about Memphis and the amazing people that make up the city. So full disclosure, our next panelist, Olivia Gacka, is one of my favorite fellow booksellers here at Novel, though she doesn't work as often as I wish she did because she's usually at her full-time gig at Rhodes, acting as Alumni Services Coordinator. She is also a highly accomplished director of local theater, and in all her spare time, loves finding ways to contribute to the Memphis community she loves so much. Our featured author this evening is Jill Fredenburg, who has spent the last 7 years working in content production and communications. From independent documentary films to educational media and curriculum writing, she's helped shape how organizations and individuals use digital media and social platforms to share their story most effectively. In summer 2020, Jill launched Jill Fredenburg Productions, LLC, to bring her skills to a variety of nonprofits, advocacy organizations, and others working towards progressive change. She's worked with clients including Georgetown University's Center for Civic Education, the Center for New Designs in Learning and Scholarship, and Novus Journal. She has also produced content for American Esoteric Laboratories and has freelance video and podcast clients. LGBTQ Revolution 2.0 is her first book. Please join me in giving a warm virtual welcome to Jill Fredenburg, Isabel Wittman, and Olivia Gacka.
Hi, that was so nice. I need you to send me that intro so that I can send that to people.
Oh my gosh, that was wonderful.
That was very nice. Hi y'all, we are so excited to be here. I am so excited to see this event happen, because as Kat said, I work for both Novel and Rhodes College. I'm also an alum of the college. I went to college with Jill and Isabel, and I'm so excited to see this event happen. Isabel and I are just going to kind of throw some questions Jill's way and just sort of chat about various things about the book. You do not need to have read the book to enjoy this discussion. I think, we're just kind of hoping to give everybody an idea of what it's about. If you haven't read it, and if you had, I think you'll just enjoy hearing a little bit of the behind the scenes information. And then there will be a Q&A at the end. So if you have a question as you come up with them in your head, you can just throw it in the Q&A and we'll hit it at the end.
I will say, if you are in Memphis, absolutely stop by Novel to get a copy because they have
a great book. And you can get them signed.
They're still signed, yes.
Excellent. So Jill, I guess I would love to hear from you, what inspired you to write this book?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. And I talk a little bit about this in the intro, but what really inspired me and what I tell people as the moment I was I need to figure out some way to make a project about this. At the time, I didn't know it was going to be a book. I was in Estonia and I had about 5 kids on different days in different classrooms come to me and come out to me and say that they did not have resources. Estonia as a country is pro-LGBT, but I was in a very Russian city, a very Russian community that believed culturally that that was an inappropriate way to exist in the world. And a lot of those kids didn't feel comfortable coming out in their communities. And I don't know what it was about my digital presence or I can't remember if I had a little rainbow on my Instagram. I don't remember what it was. It might have just been because I'm American, honestly. that these kids decided to talk to me about this. And I knew immediately, I was like, there's something wrong when so I had a specific student say, I like both men and women, and I don't really mind if someone is trans or non-binary, you know, that's not part of my preference. And I don't know what that means. And she told me, she was like, I have a feeling that I'm going to end up mostly dating men because that's what's accepted here. And it's just kind of upsetting because it makes me feel like I can't be wholly me. And as someone who identifies very heavily with the bisexual label and has been dating a man for most of my, like all of the romantic relationships I've had, I understand that weird feeling of like knowing that you're madly in love, but also wanting to be able to be representative of a community, because, you know, there are going to be some students who feel the same way and who end up needing the courage to date somebody that could be their same gender or a gender that isn't the heteronormative acceptable one. And so I was really upset and I didn't know what to do about it. So I think I kind of like internalized that project and those feelings. And then a couple of years later, when I was at Georgetown, I had the opportunity to write a book. I had a professor named Eric Coester who wanted to work with me on something. And at first I was playing around with the idea of just like a collection of feminist stories. And then the more I thought about it, the more I realized that what I think really needed to exist in the world was an example of hopeful LGBT stories, you know, because on TV, the queer people always die or, you know, get sick or get dumped horrendously or get thrown out of their households. And that isn't the case for a lot of people. And even when it is, that chosen family idea is so important, and it's not one that gets talked about very often. And so I knew I wanted to put together a collection of stories from people who weren't already famous, who didn't already have a huge, like either financial or other platform to be able to share their stories and talk about maybe a little bit of the hardship that they went through, but mostly the way that they were able to make space for themselves and feel safe in their own identities. So it was kind of like this little seed of an idea. And then I think maybe 2 years later, I was able to make it a reality, which was really exciting.
I was gonna say, I'll unmute myself. That's amazing. And I think, you know, that definitely is reflected in the book. You can very much see that it's as much a resource as it is a chronicle of, you know, queer joy. And I think that that's really important. And Isabel, do you want to take our next question? Or
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you kind of touched on it a little bit, really emphasizing finding positive stories to tell and to highlight. So when you were going about finding those people to interview, really, how did you really create space for the people that you were talking to feel comfortable about talking about it, and, you know, guiding those conversations to, yes, talk about the negative, but also really focus on the positive and highlighting those things? How were you able to do that?
That's an awesome question. I went in very aware that like I present very heteronormatively. Like I'm a cis white woman and I have all of these different privileges. And I knew going into some of these interviews that might be something that would make my interviewees nervous or, you know, make them feel that we didn't really have that connection. So I actually started reaching out to people who were very vocally out already and who seemed very confident in that identity, because I knew that even if I couldn't interview them specifically, they could, you know, introduce me to someone and be kind of that connector, so that they would know that I wasn't some like random woman coming to try to like get their tragedy and make money off of it. And so that's how I approached it too, was that all of the funds from this book go to different LGBT organizations. And so putting that out there first and saying like, this is not a money-making endeavor. Like, I just want this to exist because like 14, 15-year-old Jill needed a book like this. And then explaining that to them while also just never going in with a bunch of like, what's your coming out story? You know, I feel like that's something that happens a lot. And since publishing this book, I've had people ask me intrusive questions about both my sex life and my romantic life that I think happens to LGBT people more than anybody else. And so I think part of it was honestly just not asking those questions was really refreshing for a lot of my interviewees. You know, they were like, oh, this is like a genuine relationship that you're wanting to form with me. And then they were willing to chat about it. And like keeping up with them since has been the best part of this whole project. Honestly, like doing these interviews felt like therapy in a lot of cases. And it wasn't like we're both going to cry about how hard it is to be LGBT. It was, how cool is it that we get to meet each other because of this connecting identity? And even when a lot of those small details were different, it was such a learning endeavor. And I think that was part of what makes the book so powerful, is how all of these different people can unify under this umbrella and are still figuring out exactly what words to use and where they fit under that umbrella, but knowing that they do, because this, especially with the new generation of LGBT people, like we are making that space, and even people younger than us are going to continue to make these new spaces. And I think asserting that was the coolest part about all of my interviews. So I think that's how people felt comfortable, was they knew what my intentions were going in, and they knew that they got to control every part of the story. I sent everyone their own chapter to edit if they wanted to before the publisher even saw it. So I think I tried as hard as I could to be very intentional with every part of the process. I'm sure that there are identities that I missed and things, but I'm hoping that maybe that could be a future project, is just gathering even more and more stories for as long as possible.
I love that. And I was curious how the interviewees, you know, felt about it. So it's awesome that, you know, I'm sure they were very excited to be, so not just interviewed and then abandoned, but to be like continually part of that process and to feel a sense of ownership, you know.
Right. And also just to say, I mean, to have, you know, these people share their stories and not have it centered around the sexualization of your identity, to be focusing more on the emotional identity and the community building that happens within that. I mean, I feel like that's such an important thing resource to have for people, and something to really feel comforted by, because you're so right. I mean, I feel like for me, I mean, I identify as pansexual, and that feels like fetishized and sexualized all the time. And you get people asking you really personal sexual questions, and it's like, you don't ask heterosexual people kind of the same thing when they talk about, oh yeah, I'm straight, and you're like, tell me about your sex life, and you're like, what? So no, absolutely, I really do appreciate that you really highlighted that, the emotional side and identity of your sexuality.
And that oh, sorry, Jill, you unmuted.
Oh, I was just gonna say thank you for saying that, because it means a lot.
Absolutely.
So we've used the word resource a lot to sort of describe the book, and like I said, you know, for those who haven't had the chance to read it yet, it really is not just in terms of I want to say like the validation and the information by way of experience that these interviewees provided and that Jill provides, but also in the fact that there is an entire chapter about like a brief overview of LGBTQ plus history up to this point. There's also throughout the book, she weaves like personal narrative with research and like cites sources, you know, like a good Rhodes student does. And I guess I would love to hear you talk a little bit about how you arrived at that format and just what it was like to strike that balance of narrative and research resource.
I love that question. No one has asked me that yet. So when Dr. Quester approached me to write a book, we talked about a memoir for a minute, because a lot of that like angst that I was feeling was born from those conversations that I had in Estonia. And then the more I thought about it, the more I realized that, first of all, that like letting people into my life in that way wouldn't be that helpful, because I spent so much of my time at Rhodes and before that very on the fringe of LGBTQ spaces. So like loving all of my friends that were LGBT, but not being super vocal about being that myself because of my, like, again, heterosexual presenting relationship. I didn't want to take up space. That wasn't my space to take. And so if I had written like a memoir, which was the original plan, it would have been sad. Like, it would have been like, I would have ended well, because it would have been like, yeah, I'm still bi and happily married and like, I'm super stoked to be in my relationship and like all of those things. But like, there would have been a lot of underlying, oh, she's not being 100% herself. And I didn't want to do that. And so as I was thinking about what it would mean if I didn't do a memoir, and I didn't want to write a fiction book because that, like, I love fiction so much, but that's so easy to mess up when you're working in identities like that without doing proper research anyway. So I knew I started thinking about what book would I have wanted at that time. Like when I was, I think I've known I was bi since I was like 14 or 15 years old. And I needed an example of a happy person who was dating someone regardless of gender and had that identity and didn't need to be like super vocal about it all the time. A big theme in the book is that being safe and then making room, where you need to prioritize your own safety. And I think a lot of the messaging that I was getting at that time was, okay, well, if you're out, you need to be 100% out with everybody in your life all the time, or else you are inauthentic, or you're not being a good queer person if you're not 100% you all the time, being really loud about it. And that was not accessible to me. I was at a school where that would have gotten absolutely shut down immediately. I would have gotten expelled. And I think that little memories, like a bunch of little things in my brain were saying, okay, you need to write this nonfiction book, but it needs to not just be you, because everyone under this umbrella is so different. And to try to touch on as many identities as possible while still having that full story from everyone, not their entire life story, but whatever memories they most would want to see in a book like this, was how the format came about. Yeah, it was definitely weird. And citing all of the sources was really interesting because it proved to me how little research there actually was about bisexuality specifically. Like gay and lesbian folks get studied, still not enough, definitely still not enough, but way more than people who are open to, or to whom gender is not an obstacle in their romantic options. Yeah, no, the research part was fun. It was all fun, honestly.
So and Olivia, I'm just going to go off track a little bit here. So, I mean, you said there really isn't a great deal of research on bisexuality. So really, how did you navigate that, finding those resources and reaching out to people to bridge that gap?
Yeah, that's an awesome question too. So one of the chapters is an interview with Robin Oakes, who is a bisexual icon. Like she was like proudly proclaiming her bisexuality before that word was used commonly. And so I asked her for a lot of resources because I couldn't just find them. Googling I was using like Georgetown's library system the same way that we used to use Rhodes's, and there wasn't anything coming up. And a lot of my bisexual research would bring up like really old terminology that was offensive to trans people, and like just a very strange listing of like bringing up kind of irrelevant things when I was looking for a specific topic. And then when I was doing my transgender research for some of the other people in the book, like that research was also really convoluted with other things. So it's interesting to me how for some reason gender seems to be the thing that like convolutes research, because women loving women make sense to people and men loving men make sense to people. But like anyone who's in between or past those binaries or doesn't exist on that spectrum at all, like gets ignored. So it was a lot of asking the experts that I was speaking to. And that's how the Finding Experts chapter in the book happened, was I was getting so frustrated with not being able to find enough resources and not being able to find enough content. And so it might not be that it's not out there. It might be that it's not easily accessible, right? Like I might have not known exactly what to type in, but that's a problem. And so then this whole Marjorie Garber, I think, was the woman that I took some content from and wrote about was this idea that when you're first coming into LGBTQ identity, those resources are really important. And that's where really awesome platforms like YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, like there are really thriving LGBT communities on these platforms. And you want to find an expert. And right now, that expert might not be in academia. They might be someone who looks and sounds like you, because it is good to find someone with a lot of your similar characteristics so that you can see yourself living that happy life, if you can, on a platform like that, and they may end up becoming your expert. And so it's just a very interesting thing that the internet has allowed us to do. The opposite end of that spectrum is that the internet can be a really dangerous place for LGBT people specifically. And so the research question is a really interesting one because I think it's severely lacking. But we also need people who are very intentional and want to portray the LGBT community well to be the ones doing that research, because otherwise it's so easy to be like, oh yeah, bisexual people don't count. Like they don't matter. It's whoever they chose to be with in a monogamous relationship in the end that matters, which is what happens a lot. And the same goes for gender questions and things like that. Like it's so easy for particularly academics to write off those ideas when that is what we need to be studying right now. And that's what we need to be figuring out, especially because Gen Z is like coming up with even more new terminology that like I'm gonna have to learn, you know, and that's really exciting. So we need to figure out a way to funnel the right questions to the right people and really start looking at this stuff.
Yeah, what I found really compelling was, you would present statistics in the book, but then you would qualify it with, but keep in mind, like this study didn't ask about, like, this was just about people who identified as gay and lesbian, or who were in same gender relationships, like quote unquote, whatever that means. So like, it's an acknowledgement that the data, even the data that we do have, has potential to be flawed. And that becomes a problem when you look at things like the census, which I know you talked about, like when we're talking about resource allocation, like those things really do matter. And that's another reason why I think this book is so important, is that, it doesn't just speak to people who, that was one of my questions was, this, as I was reading this book, I was like, oh, this book would be great for this person. Oh, no, this book would be great for this person. Like, you find a way to really reach out to not just people who are already in the queer community, but people outside of it, people who think they may be part of it, people who are parents of people who are friends, and that was one of the populations that I think I found most compelling, that I found to be an audience, was people who are already in the LGBTQ plus community, who for whatever reason may not yet be getting on board with what is the Revolution 2.0, which I know we'll get into talking about later, but like, that's just how did you balance writing a book so effectively for like 12 different audiences?
I love the compliment in the question, Olivia. That's very sweet. Thank you.
You do this so well.
I can't take all of that credit. A lot of the time when I would ask an interviewee a question, they brought up those like dual identities, or like needing to figure out, okay, well, how do I, so for example, two people I can think about off the top of my head, Alexis's chapter and Cassandra's chapter. So in Cassandra's chapter, she talks about how she has not authoritarian, wow. She has a boss figure, like an authority figure is what I meant, in her life. And he was gay, like a gay cis man who constantly got the pronouns of a gender non-binary person wrong, who he had employed. And so there's this, LGBT on LGBT disrespect happening. And so she asks the question of like, okay, well, if you're going to be LGBT, QIA and an ally, like you need to be an ally to all of those letters. You can't, sometimes feel like, okay, yeah, I'll be inclusive of this community and this community. That's not how we can work if we're going to survive. I felt like she did a really good job of bringing that to my attention and bringing that up, because we do need to, I think, especially for people who are in my position where, I'm in the community, but I'm in a solid place, and it would be very hard. Like, I can't really get fired based on my opinions. And it's people like me who, like, our job is to call that out, even if the person is older than us and we need to like respect them in some ways. Like, we have to be very vocal about that kind of hypocrisy. And then in Alexis's chapter, she told me about how difficult it can be to, you know, she has LGBT friends who don't understand her ethnic and racial identity at all. Like, it just doesn't compute for them. And they try. But then when she's at home with her parents, she can't necessarily be vocally LGBT. And so it has to be okay for her to present, you know, some aspects of herself to some people and other aspects to other people. And I think that's a big part of where this idea that I think I've already talked about of like needing to be 100% out all the time with everyone, it's not possible for some people in order for them to maintain their relationships and feel safe in that way. And I think that's really important too. So on, like, I do appreciate the compliment, but it really wasn't me. Like, I think maybe I asked the right questions. I don't know, but people, I think the intersectionality of people will always come across in their stories if you give them the opportunity to present their stories to you in an authentic way. And I got really lucky and asked the right people on the right day, the right questions for them to feel comfortable telling me about this stuff. And it's really important. And I think that the editing process really helped with that too, where I was kind of picking and choosing what parts of an interview to present. I didn't want to just present the easy stuff. I wanted to present things that were positive in the end, that had a solution kind of, or a resolution, or, you know, wouldn't leave the reader feeling hopeless. But I always tried to select a more complicated idea, because I think that's what the LGBTQ plus revolution 2.0 is. It's being able to hold complicated ideas, but translate them for yourself so that they're not as complicated, because they're not. We just need to allot ourselves the time and the space to understand.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it was with all of the people you had interviewed for this book, you really did highlight so many of those intersections within the queer community. And I think this book really serves as a resource for mending those gaps in our community. You know, there's that gap between older people in the queer community, younger people, and people of color who also identify as queer, and non-people of color. So I really do see how this can serve as that really crucial mending of that gap, and highlighting so many different things, and helping people in the community and who are allies of the community, advocates for the community, understand that it's, you know, there's so many things weaving on constantly, and it all makes up who we are. And at the end of the day, you know, we need to learn about each other, and we need to be respectful of each other, and create those spaces. I do really want to talk about the title a little bit. So really, what is the LGBTQ plus revolution 2.0? When you talk about a second wave, kind of referring to it as second wave feminism, sort of in a similar way, what do you really mean by that?
Yeah, so when I was doing all of the academic research, people kept bringing up the gay movement, the gay movement, the gay movement. I think what that ignores often is that like trans women of color like really earned all of the rights for us that have happened, and like trans folks are still fighting for so many rights and just to like exist in the world. And so I was attracted to the idea of presenting this like kind of a new title that doesn't necessarily directly come from the gay movement, but encompasses this idea that like it's a revolution of the way that we should be talking about this. It's a revolution of the way we hold up certain individuals. So like I always use Ellen DeGeneres as an example. Like when Ellen came out, some people were mad, but she came out in like a certain way, and people already loved her, and she was like this white cis woman who was fairly wealthy, and like she was like an acceptable lesbian, right? And so I think I wanted to call it this, which is a little bit of a mouthful. If I could rename it, I would rename it A Sign on the Door, which is a reference to Robin Oakes's chapter, which was really good. So maybe maybe in the future. But I wanted to call it that mostly because I wanted people to be like, what is she talking about? And then pick up the book and see on the back cover, like this is not me saying, oh, we're in this new era necessarily, but we need to be open to talking about all of this in a drastically different way than we have, while still honoring all of the people that got us to this point. Which I go into a little bit in the history chapter, but I think it's that honoring, but then being willing to say, okay, so now we're in 2020, we're not going to use age as an excuse to not stand up for queer people to our grandparents. Like, this is not a time when homophobia is acceptable based on how old you are. We're past that. Same thing for like racism. And I feel like our generation is good at that, but we could get better at it by asking each other about what our definitions of bisexuality, pansexuality, asexuality, all of these things, what they mean, because they could look different to different people. And we're at a point where that needs to be okay, that not everyone completely agrees with a definition of something in order to still be respected. Yeah.
Do you see any problems though, kind of with moving in this direction, absolutely recognizing all of these different identities? Do you see any problems with the expansion really and potential of over labeling and creating, you know, too many different things and not having that core sense of community anymore? Do you see any issues with that?
This question came up really well in terms of asexuality, and then I had a lot of kink questions specifically. And I love labels because you can Google them and you can find people with those labels and you can use those hashtags. But I think after you use that hashtag to like find different content creators or find some people to be in like an email list with, I think that's where the specific word kind of starts to not be as useful after that fact. Because so like, for example, one of the non-binary folks in the book, Blair, is also like an extremely kinky person and wanted to talk about that in the book. But that doesn't mean that anyone that identifies as like a kinky individual is LGBT. Like, that's not how that works. They can if they want to, but then it's kind of like you need to figure out for yourself if it's just in a sexual context, because and this is one of, I think, the failures, honestly, of the book, is that there are so many different, like, you can be romantically attracted to different genders, but then only really sexually attracted to men, for example, or vice versa. There's all of these different identities on the ace spectrum where like maybe you like cuddling, but like sex is not as attractive to you. But you could be with a partner who is sexually active, and so maybe that makes you polyamorous because they need to have another partner. So it's all again, I think that need for conversation, and the reason why I say like labels are great for Google and that's kind of it, is because like my bisexuality and my pansexuality probably looks different than yours, you know, and it'll look different than the next person's. And the reason why I always say, like, if I could rename the book something a little bit less of a mouthful, it would have been A Sign on the Door, is because what Robin says is really true, where a sign on the door is just some words stuck on a door. You need to open it and see what's behind it in order to really understand what's going on and who that person is that you're building a relationship with, a friendship with, just talking to in a respectful way. I'm less worried about a bunch of new labels coming up, because I think the more people are able to sort of identify what's going on, either romantically or, you know, you could even say this in terms of, you know, someone finding like a new spirituality or something. Like, the more language we have, the easier it'll be for people to find folks that they have stuff in common with. What I think is dangerous is when people really hold on to a specific label. So like gay, for example, and say, no one else can use this. This is mine. Like you have to look like this. You have to sound like this. You have to have experienced a certain amount of tragedy or something in order for this to suit you, for this to fit you, for you to be able to use this. And I think that's something that we have broken away from to a certain extent. And that's something to celebrate, I think.
Absolutely. I think, the conversation about labels is such an interesting one because for some people, it serves so much to finally, for the first time, understand what it is that you've been feeling all this time that you didn't have a name for. And then on the other hand, you're right, like some people, labels don't serve them, especially when there are folks who don't exist within the binary, until they were presented with the fact that you don't have to, you have no way of knowing that you don't actually have to subscribe to those labels. So it's definitely, I think, a dynamic issue that will continue to take a lot of space in the conversation around the LGBTQ community. And one thing that you did mention that I found so fascinating about the book, and that I think leads into this, is this conversation about, it's something you can Google. I found it so interesting how so many different people that you interviewed referenced social media. We had Twitter, we had Instagram, we have Tumblr, and YouTube as well. And I mean, I know you said like, yeah, it's really important, but it's also really dangerous. But what I found so interesting was that for a lot of people, it's the first time that they get to experience being safe in their true identity. For you talked about how sometimes people who are trans or gender non-binary are only able for the first time to really explore that through social media, through an alternate profile. And I would love to hear you talk a little bit more about, the ways like YouTube and the content there is so important for the community, as well as, Twitter versus, Instagram and that kind of thing. I loved that part of the book.
Yeah. So I always tell people that I started figuring out that I was bi because I was watching people on YouTube talk about how they had like a crush on a girl and how they were freaking out about it. And I think there was a specific woman called Lesbian Answers on YouTube. I think she might have, and like I would need to look into this. So, and I know this is being recorded, so anyone in the future that's watching this video, please forgive me if this is incorrect. I am under the impression that she is anti-trans. So I'm not like bolstering her content at all, but she had a specific video that was, what if everyone had to come out as straight? And that video like wrecked me for 2 months when I was like 14, 15 years old, because it was my first indication that like, it is not fair that I'm having all of these conflicting feelings. I'm getting these crushes at my all girls high school, but then like I also was super excited to go to prom with the guy that took me to prom, and like what does that all mean? And this was before I had language for being open and happy to be romantically involved with non-binary and trans people too. Like I don't think that language was anywhere near me at that point. But that was like, that one YouTube video changed my outlook, because it's not that it changed anything in me, but it gave me language, and it gave me the knowledge that people outside of my little bubble did exist, because I didn't know any adults who were even just gay. I didn't have any of those examples in my life. And that was something I did explicitly ask in all of my interviews, was there a platform? Because I studied technology. I got a master's in communication, culture, and technology. So I'm really interested in how people's identities influence their presence online and vice versa. And so I specifically asked people about that. And Ari, who is a trans woman, brought up the fact that she had an entire Twitter account where she was trans, and she was herself, like she was a woman, and she is a woman, but the identity she had to perform for other people, which was like the one that she had to live in for most of her life. Up until that point, she had that Twitter as well. And it was a way to sort of practice her actual self and figure out how well that fit. And she was able to finally like let herself explore those ideas in a way that, you're right, would not have been accessible in real life. Like someone presenting male for a really long time suddenly presenting female is way more likely to get beat up, to get hurt, to get attacked. And so this online platforms give people an opportunity to kind of see how well that their true self actually fits them and how comfortable they are, which I think is a big thing. Is it goes back to this idea that like you kind of don't need to be 100% out if you are not safe in that space. Like she was able to start practicing that and go little by little. Like she talked about wearing lipstick to work one day and being so thankful that no one said anything. And now she fully is presented the way that she wants to, and she like owns it and she loves it. But she did need to do all those little things and go through sort of, in her words, an awkward phase to get there. And Twitter really helped her feel comfortable doing that. There's also a really big benefit to things like message boards. On YouTube, you could type out like, you could literally type in "coming out to my Muslim parents," for example, and you'll find an example. Or, you know, what was gay pride like in 2017? If crowds make you nervous, like there's little stuff that these platforms allow us to do that was just genuinely didn't exist for people who were dealing with these things 20, 30 years ago. So I do think it's really important. Again, the downside of that is there's a lot of algorithmic discrimination happening for particularly lesbian and trans keywords. Also a little bit bisexual, but like, especially on YouTube, LGBT content is having a really hard time actually getting into people's subscription boxes because it's seen as sexual or otherwise violent or inappropriate to advertisers specifically. And so that's something that platforms are going to be dealing with for as long as we are using these vocabulary words, right? And we have to be, as content consumers, regardless of whether or not you are LGBT, like doing things like liking and sharing individual content creators' content is so important, because like for a lot of folks, this is how they make their living, especially for trans women of color. Like sometimes that's the only job, which is also wrong, but sometimes this is the only job that they can really get, is online content creation. And so we really need to like support and share that work so that they can continue to make money.
And, you know, I think this just goes back to, again, your really wanting positivity and positive experiences and stories, because so often I feel like the narrative is the internet is a place where you experience discrimination and harassment and bullying, and to, you know, hear of other people who have found solace and community and comfort in these online spaces and kind of reclaimed these spaces as safe spaces. I think that's, you know, that just really it's really wonderful. And social media is such a strange, nebulous thing right now with how we are not really policing it, but managing to not have moments of discrimination, but to also, you know, respect everybody's right to speak their mind. But it's just, you know, it's so uplifting to hear that. And yeah, I absolutely 100% Googled when I was in middle school, what does it mean when I like girls and boys? Like, what is that? And that's how I found the word bisexual, then led me to pansexual. So absolutely, it's such a positive place. I think, okay, we have one more question and then we'll move on to Q&A, because this is, you know, 3 Rhodes grads, all class of 2017. And I know there's other 2017 alums watching right now. Shout out to like Ozak, I know you're out there. Just how did your Rhodes experience influence all of this? I mean, you obviously used some of your interviewees were Rhodes alums, and you mentioned Rhodes many times throughout the books, but really how did that experience influence this book?
Rhodes is so fun to talk about, especially with people. So when I was in DC for grad school, telling people about Rhodes was magical, because Dr. McCarthy, who's an art professor at Rhodes, once called it the like 100-acre woods, because it's such a little campus, like it's so small. And so you know everyone. And I did this really weird dance that I think might be particular to bisexual and pansexual people, where like, and most of the class of 2017 people know this, but I like met and fell in love with my now husband immediately in college. Like it was one of those stories that like if someone wanted to write a cutesy kids book about it, you could totally do it. What that meant for me, on the other hand, was like I had made all of these awesome LGBTQ friends at Rhodes, and would tell them, like, you know, like if it came up, like, yeah, I'm bi, like I'm so excited to help support you at Pride, but it etched me into like more of an ally stance, which is fine. One of the reasons I wrote this book was because I wanted to make additional space for these voices, not overpower like the voices of folks that do, like, who actually aren't able to like walk in the middle of Memphis and hold like a woman holding hands with another woman. Like I recognize that. but what that did to me while I was at Rhodes was it kept me out of a lot of spaces that I think I actually would have really benefited from. And it was so weird being in such a accepting and celebratory environment and being able to make these connections with people who were really working for LGBT rights at Rhodes, also women's rights, reproductive rights, all of these other really crucial and important things. And but feel kind of like I wasn't gay enough to be in those spaces. When I was in high school, partially because I was not in a hetero presenting relationship, was, you know, I could be in those spaces and I felt very welcome. And it's not that anyone at Rhodes ever explicitly made me feel not welcome, but I did not want to make anyone uncomfortable, because at Rhodes, like when you get into a relationship, it's kind of a big deal. It's a very like, I guess hookup culture would be the right term, where like everyone's mostly hooking up. And so like the 6 relationships that happen on that campus is very broadcasted and well known. And I didn't want to look like the straight girl going into the queer space and talking when she shouldn't have been. And I do regret that now. Like I realized that that was not the right decision for me. I should have entered those spaces and been really respectful and but still been there for my own mental and emotional health. Because I think those friendships were really crucial and important, and I missed out on a few of them because of my own like self-extraction from those spaces. And that's something that I wanted to discourage in the book too, was, you know, regardless of who you're with, you are still you. I had a straight guy at work when I was in DC ask me why it was important to talk about this. And I said, well, you're married, yeah? And he was like, yes. And I was like, are all other women, like, you just don't see them anymore? Like women just you don't see them? Like they're not important to you. You don't think that other women are attractive anymore? And he's like, no, that's not it. It's like, I still think that they're pretty. It's just that I'm monogamous. Like I wouldn't do anything. And I was like, yeah, I'm in the same spot. Like men and women haven't disappeared for me. I'm just monogamous and I'm respectful of that. So I wouldn't, you know, but like I'm not bisexual anymore. That's not how that works. And I think Rhodes kind of showed me what not to do with my identity, as sad as it is to say, but I did make some really, really important friendships. And I was out to like my little circle of friends who accepted and celebrated my identity. And my partner has, the entire time that we've been together, known and loved me 100% for that, and for the rest of me, which is huge. And I honestly think it's something that Rhodes taught him to do. And talking about it is something that Rhodes taught me to do too, is how to be okay with taking a minute to fully think your thoughts before saying them, being open to criticism, particularly like Dean Chaddock was really crucial and helpful in calling me out when I was maybe overstepping in a really productive way, and teaching me how to do that with other people. And I think a lot of the Rhodes professors are really good at that, both showing us examples of how to reflect and figure out what's important to talk about in what contexts, and figuring out how to not do that, which is awesome. I'm really grateful for my time there, because I think I learned a lot about myself and a lot about activism in general. I met some really snazzy folks, so.
I love that. And I also I think it's just such a Rhodes book, because the late great Mark Baer makes like a one quote appearance, and that's how you know, like it is a good book. And that just, I teared up when I read that part as well.
Yeah.
So y'all, we are open at this point to taking questions from you. Not like me and Isabel, no one wants to, but Jill. I don't think people want to hear.
You don't want to know about my life from working from.
I would.
Why we're here.
Badly want to hear about your life, Isabel. I don't know anything. We don't work together.
We don't work together.
But in the meantime, while we wait for questions, I suppose, Jill, I did have one little thing, which was, you know, in the spirit of how you make a point to emphasize, you know, that members of the LGBTQ plus community contain multitudes, are multifaceted, and are, quote, able to hold multiple forces in their hearts. What are you doing these days? Like, what are you excited about? Like in life, like I'm not going to make you answer that you make your own furniture, but like you make your own furniture. And I think that's amazing. But like, what are you excited about?
Yeah, Tony and I are builders. It's super fun. We're DIYers. Love that. I have a garden now, which is really fun. I'm brand new to it and I'm learning. And a lot of Rhodes people have been helping me figure out how that whole thing works, which is awesome. I'm actually copy editing for the same publisher that published my book, New Degree Press. And I'm trying to convince more and more people to write books, because now that I've done it, I'm not going to be like, I realize how easy it is, because it wasn't. It was not easy, but it was so fun, and it was worth every early morning, worth every like staying up late to hit my like 1,000 words that I needed to in order to make my deadlines. Like, it was so worth it. And now I feel really great about working for this publisher part-time, because I'm able to like try to convince people like your story matters and your voice matters. And we have copy editors. We have people who, if you're not confident in the way that you would write, who can help you through that part of the process. I think a lot of people think that you need to be like a poet or have like this really gorgeous way of with words in order to be a writer. And to a large extent, that is true for poetry and fiction. But for nonfiction, like your truth and your story is more important than anything else. And you can find people who will help you do that. So I'm really enjoying that position. I'm really having fun. I'm reading a book about Iran right now and the way that sanctions hurt people more than help people. So I'm learning at the same time. And that's just been super fun.
Clearly, we've answered everybody's questions about everything.
We have Tony said, I don't have a question because I'm super biased, but I'm so proud of my wife. Okay, we do have a question.
Oh, wonderful.
We have someone asking, what was the most difficult part of the writing process for you?
I think the most difficult part, so I'm gonna cheat, and I'm gonna do two parts. The first part was the imposter syndrome. The first part was the imposter syndrome of, I'm not good enough to be a writer. I shouldn't be writing anyway. But also the whole point of the book that I'm not gay enough to be writing this. Like, that getting over that was the hardest part of the entire writing process, because I had to constantly convince myself after every single conversation that if I wasn't going to be the one like collecting these specific stories, they might not get out there. Anyone could have written this book, and a million people probably could have done it better than I did it. But I had access to the specific people whose stories were in this book, and it wouldn't have come out in this exact way. And I love it. And I think that is really important. So like getting over that imposter syndrome was a really hard thing that I had to do over and over and over again. And I had to have very repetitive, irritating conversations with a lot of really gracious friends, convincing me that this was worth pursuing and worth doing. Tactically, getting people to answer my emails to talk to them was really difficult. And it's part of why I decided early on that I didn't want a book that was just a bunch of celebrities. One, because they are not accessible, either to like not to me, and then like the lifestyles that they would talk about and the support that a lot of them would have had would not have benefited anyone to read about, because when you're already, set up to be fine on your own, your story isn't necessarily going to help other folks that much. And so that was really important to maneuver around, is just to figure out who exactly to talk to convince them. And convince them is not the right word, because I don't think I have had any pushback from any of my interviewees. But like convincing myself that this was worth asking people to spend their time on was really tough. The actual transcribing of all of the interviews and like writing the book was hugely easy in comparison to that fear and just that big old block of like, I should not be the one doing this.
The questions are coming in now.
No, now they're coming in.
Thank you, everybody. This is awesome.
Yeah.
Isabel, you take it, Isabel, you go.
Thank you. Yeah, we have somebody asking, was there something you wished you did differently?
Yes. I was not able to like land just a Black bisexual man. I reached out to so many, and men of color have like a particularly difficult time getting represented well. And so they are a little bit more nervous, especially about this like white cis woman coming in and asking for your story. And I get it. It makes so much sense, which is a huge part of why I put that resource section in the back of the book, is because I know this did not include everyone. I really wanted to, and I pushed for it, but I think it was understandably difficult for someone with those particular multifaceted identities to feel comfortable talking to me. And I think that that's fine. It scares me to think that anyone would think I didn't want that identity portrayed, because that's not true at all. And I probably could have pushed harder, but it got to a point where I didn't want to do that for the sake of the people that I was reaching out to. So I will, I see, and I can answer this question more thoroughly, but for example, Saeed Jones is a really awesome person he's a poet who is absolutely incredible and covers the Black queer experience particularly well. And I think that I need to be better about just pointing people in the right direction for a lot of this, because I kind of had to accept that there were going to be certain folks that didn't want to talk to me because I made them nervous because of my identities, and that's okay. So that was a huge lesson I learned. And so I've tried to be better about just pointing people in the right direction when the book isn't necessarily going to serve them in the same way that it'll serve, for example, Black women.
We also have the question, do you have any recommendations for LGBTQ plus content creators? I don't know if that means as in, do you have names of LGBTQ plus content creators, or do you have recommendations for being an LGBTQ plus content creator? Maybe you know immediately what that means, but I think it's an interesting question both ways.
Yeah, I like both ways. And you're cutting out a little bit. I don't know if that's my internet.
Yeah, that was really funny slow-mo for a second.
Sorry.
So Lex Horwitz is a really great Instagram person. They are non-binary and they're fantastic. And they're one of the people that I reached out to fairly early on when I was starting to market the book, and really cared about their approval. And they loved it. So like, they're a really awesome person to add on Instagram specifically. Also, one of the interviewees in the book, their name is Cash, and they sell really awesome custom sneakers, and they're just really cool people. And their Instagram, I think, is Customs by Cash. Both of the K sounds are Ks. Who else? Again, Saeed Jones kills it on Twitter, and all of his poetry is fantastic. There's a specific, ContraPoints on YouTube is this essayist who is absolutely incredible. And I believe she uses she, her pronouns, and she is really, really, really fun. And forgive me if that is incorrect. But I will look into that. And I can also send a list if anyone ever wants to text me, if you know me in real life and like want to just text me, I can give you a full list, particular to your identity too, if you want. Like, I'm happy to do that research for you. And then just for the sake of the recording too, you can always email info@jillfredenburg.com with any other questions, and they don't have to be business related. Like, I want to help you find people that make you happy to watch, and music that you love to listen to, and just people that make you feel really represented and heard, because I didn't have enough of that early on, and I wish I had, and I love finding that for other people. Oh, and then in terms of content to create, people are already doing amazing, amazing work. I'm particularly attracted to video essay in this space. Like, I feel like queer folks have this really unique and beautiful way of particularly writing and filming video essays. So if anyone is interested in doing that, I think the internet could always use more of that beautiful work.
Okay, sorry, we have just two final questions, and I think we're gonna cut it off after these two questions. The first question that we have, if you got the opportunity to talk to your younger self, what would your message be to her?
I think, what would my message be? I think as much as I say that I knew that I was bisexual when I was like 14, 15, I didn't let myself say it until I was 17 or 18 years old. And then the people I said it to kind of had their own agendas for it. I don't mean to be cryptic and weird. It's just that like, I know that this video is being recorded and I'm like still friends with some of these people. So I don't want to be like, I don't want to throw people under the bus unnecessarily because I feel like they've learned a lot since then too. But I think I would say to my younger self that I needed to be more gracious and kind and give myself the time to really figure it out before feeling the need to like perform a certain identity for another person. My partner was really the first person that I like came out to that I felt heard me and didn't turn it into something weird. And I think if I had let myself really consider who I was going to talk to, and like find people who I knew loved me, regardless of all of these identities, like that would have been really awesome. And it's something that I encourage the young people who, when I was in Estonia and a bunch of young people were coming out to me, I always said, who do you feel confident talking to who doesn't want you to be a certain way? So like whether that is straight or like especially for bisexual people, I feel like so many people will try to push you for me to be a lesbian or to be straight. And it's hard to guess how people are going to react, and it's hard to find those people. But I always told those younger kids, and I would have told myself that like being out to myself for a certain amount of time is enough and would have been enough. And I didn't need to feel all of this pressure to figure everything out really early. It's different for things like gender because there are options for hormones and all of these other really important factors. But for things like sexuality, like so much of that does involve another person. If you're not ace, or another identifier where it doesn't involve another person. But I feel like I definitely would have told myself to be a little bit more patient. And then to also allow myself to be in those spaces respectfully that I did deserve to be in, but I like extracted myself from out of fear of taking up too much space.
And just a short wrap-up question. What is next for Jill? Will you write another book?
That's a great question. I want to. I think I'm gonna ride the wave of this one for a little bit because I'm a little bit burnt out. I've written a couple of Medium articles, and so something that I really wanted to promote is I do have a new Medium publication. It's called A Sign on the Door. And it's open to anyone about like any topic under the sun. It doesn't even need to be, you don't need to be LGBT in order to contribute to this publication. The biggest thing is that your story needs to be hopeful and empowering and have a point. Like I'm not going to be publishing someone just like crap talking other groups of people. But I really want people to feel like if they have a thought, they can think it through, and then I will help them through that whole process of editing it and getting it to a point where they want to present it to the world. So that's like my little project, my little baby project that I'm working on right now is just this Medium publication that I'm really proud of. Again, it's called A Sign on the Door. And like, if you type that in on Medium, it'll come up. And then I'm just working on more films. I had a film in Indie Memphis this year called YouTube as an Ally of Convenience. That's more of my like everyday work of studying algorithmic discrimination and the ways that people perform different identities on different technological platforms. So more filmmaking and more writing in the future, I hope.
I love that.
I'm so excited for you. This is like so surreal, here we are.
We are.
It was really good to
4
see
years
you.
out. Is it 4 years out? Oh gosh, almost 4 years out.
No, why did you say
So
the number?
I'm so sorry.
Anyway, it's fine.
I graduated in that time.
Jill's done a lot more.
You're really, I just so appreciate you being out here, being, an agent of positivity and change and uplifting those that need to be uplifted. And I'm so proud of you. And I'm just so grateful. So thank you so much, Jill. This is amazing.
Yeah, thank you, Rhodes Alumni, and thank you, Novel, for having me. This was surreal. Like putting this whole event together, I was like, oh my God, this is like the book was in stores and that was real. And then like a couple people at it and that was real. But like this makes it really, really real, is having a bookstore and my university host. This conversation means a lot.
Well, we were super, super happy to do so. It's, a lot of this job is a lot of fun, but this has definitely been a highlight of both of my jobs that I'm working right now. Am I getting paid twice? No. I did want to say before we left, y'all, that Rhodes, the Lynn and Henry Turley Memphis Center tomorrow has an awesome event happening called Are You Family? Black and LGBTQ plus in the Mid-South. And I'm sorry, I am reading it to make sure I'm getting it right. It's a panel that will feature stories covering the history of the Black LGBTQ plus community from the 60s and 70s. Conversation is going to be moderated by Gwendolyn D. Clemens, founder of the Unleashed Voice Media, and will feature Lady Wilma Taylor and Joe Calhoun. It's tomorrow at 6 p.m. and you can access the link to register from the Lynn and Henry Turley Memphis Center at Rhodes College Facebook page. And again, yeah, if y'all want to buy a copy of LGBTQ plus Revolution 2.0 from Novel, please do so. And thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for being supporters of Equalynx, Novel, Rhodes, whatever brought you here. We're grateful to have you. And we're so grateful to Jill for, of course, just being cooler than all of us.
I'm definitely not.
You're cutting out, Olivia. That was hysterical. Thank you so much again, everybody.
There's a cat.
Oh, yes. This is Johnny Cash. Hello. They were screaming this whole time. They were just let out.